The movie is available. They're having some technical issues trying to pull him on right now. No, he is on. Hey, Mr. Blackmon, thank you so much. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me. I'll be here.
Hey, we're excited to have you, and I think it's just so awesome. I know you don't have a whole lot of time. If we can just cut right to the chase, and slaverybyanothername.com is where people can reach, the book and the documentary, the PBS documentary. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, the Slavery by Another Name is about it's about how, as you were just saying, that at the end of the Civil War, slavery really didn't end the way that the conventional telling of history says that it did. There was a period of time that the emancipated African Americans did live lives of independence and freedom. I'm sorry about that. I actually just got out of a cab and was negotiating the transaction, but the African Americans were returned, many of them, to a kind of slavery, what I call neo-slavery, and that this was all part of the way that the white South reasserted its political control, and over time tried to limit the economic achievements and aspirations of African Americans, and that was something that went on deep into the 20th century and involved a perversion of the criminal justice system, and we definitely see echoes of those abuses in the world we live in today.
Wow, that's awesome. So the gist of it, though, is the criminalization of being black, and that's how it was used. That the way the laws work, once you're a criminal, you can still be enslaved.
Yeah, well, of course, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that slavery is still legal in America even today under one circumstance. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery has an exception in it that allows for slavery as punishment for a crime. That's the one exception. And so beginning in the 1880s and the 1890s, as the white South was reimposing its will on the black minority in the South, part of the way of doing that was to pass a whole raft of laws in every southern state that, as you say, effectively criminalized black life. And these were laws that didn't say they would only be applied to black people, but overwhelmingly they only were applied to black people. So it was a crime in the South to be unemployed. And any person who couldn't prove that he or she was employed in any given moment could be arrested by the sheriff and could end up sentenced to a long term of hard labor or having huge fines imposed on them that were impossible for a poor person or a farm laborer to pay, and then be sold by the county or by the state to a farm or a coal mine or a timber camp to pay off these fines that were imposed on them. It was also a crime in the South to try to change jobs if you didn't have permission from your employer, if you were a farm worker. So a black man who had signed a contract to work through a season with a white landowner, if another white man came along and said, I'll give you a better deal at my farm, or even if the black man was being whipped in the field or starved to death because the landowner wouldn't share provisions or share the benefits of the crop, or the landowner was assaulting his wife, which was going on all the time in those days. But no matter how terrible the circumstances might be, if a black man tried to find a different job in a different place without permission, that was actually a criminal offense. He could be arrested in the same sort of way, end up living the life again as a slave in a coal mine somewhere where the life expectancies were short and conditions were incredibly brutal.
Wow. And I think in the movie and the book, it was so deep. The violence was literally the same as during slavery, the whippings, the beatings, and like you said, the death rate was just so high.
The violence at that time may well have been worse than it was in the old kind of slavery that we know more about, because in the kind of slavery that existed before the Civil War, an enslaved person was an extremely valuable economic asset. And, some person had spent a lot of money. Generally, a slave-holding landowner would have invested far more money in buying people than in land. And so because of that, even though the brutality of the old kind of slavery was vicious and incredible, nonetheless, it was not in the interest of any slave owner to whip a slave to death or to injure them so much so that they couldn't work anymore.
Wow.
And so in a perverse way, that actually protected enslaved people up to a certain point. But in this new system that I write about, it was incredibly cheap and easy to acquire a black man through the criminal justice system or through just the kind of system of kidnapping that developed in response to all of this.
Right.
And so, so since it was so cheap, then people were worked to death. They were whipped to death. They were beaten to death. They were waterboarded. They were tortured in medieval ways. It's stunning how graphic and horrible the mistreatment was.
Well, it's literally amazing, and so this carried on. You're counting all the way this criminalization of being black. Obviously, still till this day in a lot of ways, but it shifted to this peonage thing where people just owed money also.
Well, and peonage covers a wide range of things, but and a lot of the stuff we're more familiar with than other things are related. So we all have a picture in our minds of sharecropping. We may not completely understand what sharecropping was like or what it was about, but we have this image in our mind of a very poor black family living in a shack out on a farm somewhere under difficult circumstances. And that picture could also apply to what you might call farm tenants, which is another system of things. But all of these things were closely related and were closely related to the way that people were being re-enslaved through the criminal justice system and then by kidnappings and other things. But all these different mechanisms of holding black people in their place, quote unquote, and limiting their ability to achieve economically, because the economic interest of the South was when white Southerners needed these 4 million, 5 million, 6 million black farm workers to get to grow a crop every year all across the South, and all of America needed those laborers to be there. They needed them to be around in the spring for the planting, and they needed them around in the fall for the harvest, and they needed them to cost as little as possible. So they didn't want black people to move away, but they also didn't want black people to succeed enough that they would begin to have expectations of a life that would make them want to make more money for the work that they were doing. And so it was an intricate and treacherous system, but all of it was based on essentially getting black people into a vulnerable economic position where they ostensibly owed money to somebody else, and that until they paid that off, they had no liberty to move on. And that system of entrapping people in a debt cycle was manifested itself in all these different systems, the most terrible of which was to end up as a quote-unquote convict laborer, which in fact was a form of slavery.
Making money off the criminalization of being black. And this can and so you speak about it ending not in the movie like there was an end date, kind of. There's a soft end date after World War II.
Yeah, what happened at the time of World War II was a bunch of things happened. One was that during the war, even at the very beginning of World War II, there was a recognition at the highest levels of the government that the mistreatment of African Americans was the sort of thing that the enemies of the United States might well try to exploit that to try to send messages and do propaganda aimed at African Americans saying, why are you fighting for these people who continue to so brutalize you and brutalize your families? And white people have a long history of doubting the patriotism of black people. And even though there's been no evidence ever, black people have shown this astonishing, frankly, irrational level of patriotism through all of time. But nonetheless, that idea that maybe that these practices made America look bad in the eyes of the world and might be used against America, that finally motivated some steps during World War II to try to bring an end to some of these practices. There were some white people who were finally prosecuted in the 1940s for still holding slaves. I know that's a hard thing to believe, but the first serious prosecution of somebody for holding a slave didn't come until 1942. Wow. And but then the other big thing that was happening then was just the world was changing and technology was changing, and the first tractors were going into the field. The first chemicals were being introduced that could kill weeds instead of chopping them out by hand. And so the need for these millions of laborers began to decline. And so these practices that were mostly about making money and getting economic benefit out of people, they began to recede as well. But there certainly were examples of things like this that continue to happen on a much smaller scale, and there are things like this that happen to this day, primarily to migrant farm workers and Mexicans in South Florida who were being subjected to similar sorts of practices in 2015.
Hey, the reality of it. If we can take a caller, I know you're about to hit that plane in a minute. If we can take a caller, Brother Sekou was on line 3.
Sure, go ahead. We got a minute.
Great. Brother Sekou, yes, sir.
Hey, good morning. It's still morning, right?
Yes,
right.
Indeed.
Hey, brother, could you get that letter?
No, I didn't get it.
I dropped it to your church.
Okay.
All right, you can check it out. It's very important. Anyway, Mr. Blackmon, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Did you speak at Tulane about a week or two ago?
More like a month at Loyola. I was in Loyola Law School about a month ago.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that I missed the thing. You know, I was disappointed I missed that some other matters that's pressing. But I just want to compliment you for a white man. I was surprised. I thought there was a black man who wrote that book when I first picked it up, right? It's a powerful book, and it's a statement of the real reality of what life has been for African people in this country, right? So keep on writing more stuff like that, man. And
well, thank you.
This comes from a black man who don't necessarily trust most white people, period, all right? All right? So
that's a
read the book a couple more than one time. And keep on writing some stuff like that, man. All right, brother, Reverend Sylvain, check the letter out, and I'll be in touch with you.
Good deal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Blackmon. Yeah, we appreciate that. Is the book is so rich. You know, it literally is. Now, and thank you, Brother Sekou. Now, as we look at that, you have created a whole system to educate the community and schools with this information. How's it coming?
Well, do you mean the sort of curriculum materials,
right,
things like that you can find at PBS.org? Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's a wonderful amount of information and materials there. That it's one of the great things about public television, and people should remember that, is that when a project like the documentary film Slavery and Another Name, when that was produced, and we always intended that for public television, PBS really requires now that for those kinds of projects that there be a really substantial educational component to it. And so there are some terrific materials and outtakes from the film. There's a curriculum there. A whole lot of stuff was developed over time by some really brilliant people, and I played a small part in it. But what much of that's really about is just how teachers can approach difficult topics. You know, how do you actually, because so many teachers are terrified, oftentimes for reasons I can't quite figure out, but people have come to believe that if they take on difficult subjects in the classroom, that they're going to get in trouble or that they'll lose their job, even though you can hardly ever find anybody that's happened. And so one of the things I really push hard for with almost everybody I talk to about this is that it's important for people to just wade into these conversations. And just like with your last caller, you know, he assumed that it was a black man who had written this book. Of course, that is almost my last name, but I do cop to being a white man. but in the end, we just need to push into these things and not worry so much about who's saying it or what they look like or why they're saying it, and just have some dialogue about this stuff and not worry so much about whether a teacher worrying about that they may use the wrong word or say it the wrong way. And I just tell people, you know, I've never seen anybody's head explode because they tried to start a conversation with somebody else about a difficult subject. And because once people start talking about these things, one, the facts become clear. And this is undeniable history. There's no disputing that these things happened and the terrible effects that they had on our society. And we have to just wade into them and start talking about them. And amazingly, people are much more open to those dialogues than a lot of people assume. And so I hope that your listeners will check out those educational materials. And to my great surprise to some degree, and but also pleasure, increasingly I hear from college students and teachers all around the country, people are talking about this aspect of history in a way that really was never talked about before.
I think it's so awesome because I can tell you I would assume anybody who really reads it, there's so many things that we did not understand, but by placing that in context, anybody over 60 years old now, and that's almost me, or really 60 and 70, those ages, it helps give an idea of what they were dealing with. Even though if they may not have been enslaved, they always had the fear or the thinking that they could end up that way. So it affected families, it affected anything. So those are the parents and grandparents of today. So we can really see the situation we're living in, how it's just a result of that oppressive system, that people were saying it ended in 1865, but by means no.
Yeah, that's a pretty profound observation, and you're exactly right. That there, and I have people come up to me all the time after I've made an appearance somewhere and talked about the book, and I'll have an older African American man or woman come up to me and say things like, "Now I really understand what was happening when I was just a little girl, but when my older brother came back from World War II in 1945, right. And he showed up in the middle of the night on our farm in South Georgia or South Alabama, and he came in and woke us up and said, okay, we got to leave right now, and we can't even wait till the morning. Now's our only chance to get away." And they would pack everything up and take off in the middle of the night.
Wow.
And that those kinds of things happened all the time. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are alive today who were born on a farm in Louisiana or Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama or North Florida or South Carolina, that they were born out in the rural Deep South into a place where there was still slavery, because they were born in the 1930s and 1940s, where people were still enslaved and were being intimidated. And there are thousands of those people who are still alive today. They may or may not completely understand what was happening in their childhood, but that was the world that they and their parents faced.
The reality of it, mass incarceration. We always speak about the criminalization of being black. As you said, the philosophies of, obviously it's, for those that believe in this, that white supremacy, that philosophy is still flying through, some of the policies we have now.
Well, I think that what we're looking at now are, it's not the same laws, and almost all the laws that I talk about in my book, and I was citing earlier in this conversation, most of those laws are not on the books anymore. They were eventually struck down. The legal system went through a dramatic overhaul in the 1950s that eliminated a lot of these particular statutes. But it's still the case that through the kind of incredibly aggressive enforcement regime that has been put in place in the United States, as a part of the drug war in particular, in the 80s and the 90s, and it's important for us all to remember that in the 80s and the 90s, when crime rates were soaring and people had a real sense that they didn't understand where things were going to go and how bad it might get, particularly in inner city neighborhoods, that all kinds of people were supportive of these draconian penalties. And if you go back and look at the polls from the late 80s, black people and white people overwhelmingly supported these incredibly tough enforcement regimes. And black people supported them because they were more likely to live in neighborhoods that were seeing lots of trouble and lots of violence. And so we all kind of walked into this scenario where we were, frankly, encouraging the police to become incredibly ferocious in their enforcement. But the reality is that it has now turned into something that, A, is not necessary, for sure, and B, has had these gigantically terrible consequences, and it has, particularly for African Americans, because it is overwhelmingly affecting African Americans more than others. But it's very similar in the way.
Yeah, and just not to cut you off, but I just want to thank you as we close on out. I can't appreciate you enough. Thank you for taking the time. I know it was right in a busy schedule, but we appreciate everything that you've said. Hey, for everybody, let's keep on pushing, make it happen.
Oh, my God, it's big, so strong, so mighty. My God's plans for me goes beyond my wildest